My name is Richard Thomas England. I was born April the 1st, 1947, near Mammoth Spring, Arkansas. My mother's name is Frida Elizabeth Armstead England, and my father's name is Novus Wesley England. My place of birth and where I grew up was about 5 miles south of Mammoth Spring, Arkansas. And my parents, my father was born in that area and lived there all of his life. My mother was born in West Virginia, and her family, her father, mother, brother, and herself, moved from West Virginia to southern Missouri, a place called Mountain Grove, and they lived there for a short while. My grandfather, Armstead, Isaiah Washington Armstead, was a sawmiller. That became his profession when he moved there. He had been a store owner and proprietor of the store, postmaster, and so he sold out his business when they moved to Missouri. And he operated the sawmill there. It was a steam-powered sawmill. Operated the sawmill there for a few years and then moved to northern Arkansas near Mammoth Spring and bought some timberland there and operated the sawmill and did some farming and whatever. Did several different things. Other than operating the sawmill, they had other machinery like a cider press and sorghum mill and so forth. So they did work for other farmers in the area too, pressed their sugar cane and so forth. So my mother grew up there, and when the Second World War started in 1941, a lot of the people, like my mother, moved into town so they could work in whatever industry was there, which happened to be Franz's chicken plant where they processed chickens, and at the same time my father had started working there too, so that's where my mother and father met. And they also stayed at the same boarding house, so they became acquainted that way too. And shortly after that they got married and moved out of the boarding house, of course, and rented a house. And so they lived there for a short while in town. And meanwhile, my grandfather England, Isaac Cleveland England, had bought some land about 5 miles south of town where I grew up. And he split the land up and gave half of it to my father, and they built identical log houses. I guess you could call it a log cabin, except it had 4 rooms, not just one. And so my grandfather's house was on the east side of the highway that ran through there, and my father's house and land was on the western side. And the highway that ran through there is Highway 63, was not paved at that time. It was just a dirt gravel road. And that's, of course, the place where I was born and raised. And my sister was born first. She's like 4 years older than me. And then my brother James was born 14 months before me. And then my younger brother Roy was born about a year after me, maybe 2 years, 47, 49, 2 years or so. And so that's where we grew up, and it was like a small farm. We had a barn, we had chickens, pigs, ducks, and cattle. And so we raised about all of our own food. We had a huge garden, orchard, and just, survived pretty much off of what we grew and whatever we could, whatever game we could find or fish. We lived about 2 or 3 miles from the river. There was a creek about a mile down the mountain from where we lived, and we could always catch fish just about any time. When my parents started having children, I think it was kind of strange at first. My sister was born first, and they thought she would be a boy, so they were going to name him Charles. So when she was born, it turned out she was a girl. So they said, well, what are we going to name her? And said, well, we could just change Charles to Charles. And then the doctor said, well, you have to have a middle name too, because he was filling out the birth certificate. And my mom, I don't remember if she said she couldn't think of a name, or she said something my daddy didn't like. But anyway, my dad came up with the name Thermaline, and I don't know where that came from. It might have been from one of the old children's stories or something like that. But anyway, her name became Charles Thermaline. It was kind of an odd name, but then the next child that was born is my brother James, and I'm not sure where the James came from. I don't recall anybody in our family that was named James before that. But his middle name is Wesley, which is my dad's middle name. My dad's name is Novus Wesley, England. And so that was his name, James Wesley, England. And then I was born next. So my name, Richard Thomas, came from 2 of my uncles. And my uncle, Richard Eli Armstead, my mother's youngest brother. And then the Thomas came from my uncle Otis, my dad's brother. His name was Otis Thomas. And also their uncle was named Thomas. He was my grandfather's oldest sibling, which I think Thomas was like 10 years older than any of the rest of them. And so we never I don't remember ever seeing him. I don't know if he passed away before. I don't know, really. But I remember going to school with some of his grandchildren, and I remember meeting at least two of his children. Harry England, his grandchildren went to school with us, rode the same school bus, and trying to remember the name of the lady. I know she would come and visit my grandfather occasionally when I was young. I remember her husband better than I remember her. Because he was this big bald-headed guy that did funny stuff. He would make animal noises and tell jokes. Funny guy. Anyway, so yeah, that's how Charles, James, and myself got our names. Then the next born was Roy Lee, and my mom, I don't remember who came up with the name, but the first name they came up with was Leroy. And then they said, well, there's too many Leroys. We need to name him something different, you know. And so one or the other of them said, oh, we'll just name him Roy Lee. That'll take care of that. So his name was Roy Lee. So that's how we all got named. And it's kind of strange that the family that lived down close to the creek, the Cases, had a son named Roy Ray, who was born at about the same time. And Roy Ray had a sister born at the same time. So they were like, what do you call it?
Fraternal twins.
Fraternal twins. Her name was Anna Faye. So we grew up with them like it was like being next door in Arkansas where we lived. They were a mile away, but we spent a lot of time with them.
Can you, were you close with your aunts and uncles and cousins?
And when I was growing up, most of our family members lived at least several miles away. Of course, our grandparents lived right across the road, the Englands, Cleve and Essie England. Most of our cousins, well, some of them on my mother's side weren't too far away. My mother's parents lived on the west side of Mammoth Spring, out about 20 miles or so, and far out in the country, even off of the paved road or the improved roads. The road, their driveway, I guess you'd call it, was like 2 or 3 miles long, and it was just a trail through the woods. You couldn't drive through there in a normal car. You had to have a truck. It's hard to get through there with a car, but some people did it. It went up hills and down hills and through gullies and creeks and over big rocks. And sometimes you just had to detour around big rocks that the dirt had washed away from them, and they stuck up so high you couldn't drive a car over them. It was kind of crazy.
That was your grandparents?
Yeah, the Armsteads. The Armstead grandparents lived way out in the woods, and of course my grandfather, being a sawmiller, he had cut all of the lumber to build their house, and they had like a 2-story country house, and they built several barns and sheds and so forth, just using the oak lumber they had sawed at the sawmill. And they always had a sawmill there. Even after the steam engine quit working, by that time they could get a gasoline engine out of a car or a truck and just use it to run the sawmill, and they did that a lot. So there were several old cars sitting around there with the engines missing. Well, they weren't missing, they were there somewhere. They had put them in the sawmill and ran them till they quit. And then they'd get another one and do the same thing again. So there were a lot of old cars sitting there, and some of them would be worth thousands of dollars nowadays, being antiques. There was old Cadillacs and Lincolns and you name it, Hudsons, and of course a lot of Fords.
But no engines.
Yeah, the engines were there. They'd just been worn out.
Oh.
It's pretty crazy. And a lot of old farm machinery. That place was covered up with old threshing machines, and I remember the sorghum press still sitting there in the field, rusting away. And my two of my uncles stayed around there, Ben and Harold. Harold never did leave home until after my grandparents died. And my Uncle Ben, he became the sawmiller, and he always had a sawmill there up on the hill above the house behind the barn. And we'd go out there about every weekend on Sundays, and they'd cook dinner. All of our most of our cousins and aunts and uncles would be there from the Armstead family. My Uncle Clyde was a sign painter. He lived in town in Mammoth Spring. He painted about all the signs around there. And he had 4 children. There's Darlene, Polly, Jerry, and Mike. Jerry was my age, and Darlene and Paula were older, and Mike was younger. So they'd be there a lot of the time at my grandparents' house on the Sunday, and then Ben would be there with his children. Harold never did get married, and he just spent all of his time there with the grandparents and worked with Ben at the sawmill. And they would go out and cut trees off the property and bring them into the sawmill and cut them up. And my Uncle Harold, he was kind of a tinkerer, and he would, I know one time he bought a gas-powered welder that had a gasoline engine so he could do welding, and he got a small pension from military service because he was deaf in one ear, and I think he said that he was an airplane pilot in the Army and had busted his eardrum from flying. So anyway, he got a pension from that. Anyhow, yeah, he was always doing something like welding or machine work, or was trying to think. Oh yeah, he bought a bulldozer. Of course, they could use it as a tractor to pull logs out of the woods and stuff like that. But he would hire out to different people around. He would build ponds and grade land and whatever people wanted done. So he did that for a while. He also ran a printing press. My grandfather had traded lumber, I guess, for a print shop, and it was, I guess they had to build the building that they put it in, but it had a printing press and a whole bunch of type and stuff like that, graphics, whatever. And when we were there on Sundays, we'd go up there sometimes and just play with the print shop stuff. We'd set up type and print stuff. I guess the most difficult thing was getting paper to print on, because there wasn't any paper around. And sometimes we'd just print on top of something else, like an old newspaper or something. It was something to do. There was always something to do there.
And what about your dad's parents? Did you spend much time at their house?
Well, all the time that I was growing up, my England grandparents lived just right across the street, so we were just back and forth all the time. So I wonder we didn't get run over by a truck. But yeah, we spent a lot of time. It's just like one big family. My grandfather Cleve always had a nice garden. He grew grapes, the sweet Concord grapes. Had a big orchard. They had all kinds of stuff out there in the orchard, mainly peaches and apples. I guess those were the easiest thing to grow. And in the summertime, anytime that the vegetables or the orchards were producing, we would be processing whatever it was and canning it. We would can everything, all kinds of vegetables and fruit and jam and jelly and just anything that grew. So we spent a lot of time just doing that. And of course there were times we did other things, like we would go fishing. We'd spend days down at the river just catching fish. And my mother actually figured out one time how to can fish, so she did some of that. We could catch a lot of fish if we set out a bunch of lines. You could tie fish lines to the tree limbs and run them across the river. Could run a trot line across the river and have 20 or 30 hooks on it. Of course, you had to keep going back and forth to check them and take the fish off when they got caught. But it produced a lot of fish to eat. And sometimes we'd give them to the neighbors if we caught a lot. We had neighbors all around, like the Martins lived just up the hill from us. They were a pretty sizable family. They were about the closest neighbors we had, except for my grandparents. And then there was an old German guy that lived over a little farther away behind the Martins up that road.
Were the Martins the ones with Roy Ray and Anna Ray or whatever?
They were related.
Okay.
Roy and Anna Faye's mother was the sister of Noel Martin, who was the father of the family that lived up the hill. And they had a lot of older children, like, next, the one that was nearest to our age was Leon, and he was probably 6 years older than me. Then one of the girls, Laureen, had a son named Billy, and he was probably 4 years younger than me. So we were never, playmates to speak of. Sometimes we'd go fishing with Leon. Just walk down to the creek or the river and go fishing.
Can you tell me about a couple of things? First of all, your first bicycle, and second, did you ride the school bus in to school, or did you walk? I don't know which one of those came first. How old were you when you got your first bicycle? Did you have a school bus that you rode to school?
Yeah, like when I remember when I was very young, my sister, of course, was the first to start to school, and I always started in the first grade. They didn't have a kindergarten, and they were supposed to be 6 years old at the beginning of school, or within the first month or something like that. Something weird rule about it. Anyway, my sister was the first one of us that went to school, and they had just started busing children into the city to a city school. It was actually a county school in the city. And prior to that, all the children went to a country school, and they had to walk. Our country school was on Big Creek, which was a little more than a mile away from where I lived, through the woods. And I remember our neighbors that I was talking about, the Martins, Leon, and I think Leland too, maybe Laureen. But anyway, they would walk by our house every day to go to school, and they'd jump over my grandfather's fence and walk through his pasture to take a shortcut. And my grandfather had actually built steps to go over the fence so they wouldn't tear his fence up, I guess. But they would go across Granddaddy's pasture and then walk down the dirt road about a half a mile or so, and then cut through the woods by Brown Spring. There's sort of a trail that went through there, and then there was the school on the creek over there. We played a lot over there when I was a kid at the schoolhouse, because there's kind of a deeper part of the creek right there. It wasn't real deep, but it was deep enough that you could jump in it and cool off and maybe swim a little bit. But it was a good place to hang out and play.
Did they close the school?
Well, after they started busing the kids to the city for school, the old country school, it actually sat on some land that belonged to a lady named Brown that lived in Memphis. Her family had moved to Memphis, and they still owned all that land right there. I think it was 60 acres. Anyway, she had given them permission to build a schoolhouse there when they built it. And so it was actually belonged to her. But then my grandfather, Cleve, knew her, and he got permission for them to have a Sunday school there. So they had Sunday school and church there for a short while until they built a church at Union Hill. And it wasn't a fancy church. It was just a little building with asphalt siding on it and a tin roof, I think I remember. And it had a little bell cupola on top of it. I remember him ringing the bell for church.
Was he a preacher?
Well, my grandfather had gotten religious at some time late in life. I'm not sure exactly when, but I think it was probably about the time they started having their church service in the old schoolhouse. Him and some of the older neighbors got together and decided they were going to start having church. And I remember also that we went to the Baptist church in town a few times. I think my mother insisted that we all go to church when I was just a toddler. Because I remember we would all get in my daddy's Model A Ford Coupe and go to church. And being a coupe, it only had, 2 adult seats in it. And then it had a little rumble seat in the back. So when the weather was nice, we could sit in the back rumble seat. But when the weather got bad, we all had to crowd in some way. And I remember me and my brother James could wrap up in a blanket with inside the rumble seat and shut the lid down so we wouldn't get wet or cold or whatever. But then Charles would sit in the front between my parents, and then my brother Roy would sit up on the back of the seats. There was a little shelf back there. He was small enough to sit back there. I'm sorry.
I do want to take a break pretty soon.
Yeah, I need to take one for
sure.
sure.
But before we go, can you tell me your parents' names? Like my mom's name is blah and my dad's name is blah.
The road there, the Highway 63, was not a paved road at that time. When I was about 5 years old, they paved the road. They rebuilt the whole road. And straightened it out some and made it better. Rerouted it in places and then paved it. And by that time, my dad had quit working at the chicken plant, and my mom had quit before that when she started having babies. And so they no longer worked at the chicken plant. And of course, the chicken plant had downsized its operations after the war. And so my dad went to work for the construction people that were building the highway at that time. And he ran a drill, drilling in the rock so they could dynamite the rocks out. So that they would drill several holes and fill them full of dynamite and then set the dynamite off and break up the rocks so they could use a bulldozer and move them away. And shortly after they built the road there, they ran electricity. They started an electric co-op that they dammed up the North Fork River and made a power plant there and ran electricity out to all the rural areas. They had already had electricity in most of the towns from one source or another. But up until that time, we had not had electricity. We had a battery-powered radio. We had kerosene lamps. We even had a kerosene-powered refrigerator. And it was an absorption-type refrigerator. Ran on a little flame in the bottom that percolated ammonia up through it and did the refrigeration process. And before we had that, we had an ice box. You'd put a big block of ice in it, and it would keep things cool for a while. Of course, in the wintertime, we didn't need refrigeration. We could just put stuff out on our back porch and let the cold weather keep it. And it seemed to be colder back at that time than it is nowadays. Global warming, I guess.
Can you tell me about when they put the electricity in your house?
I was probably 5 years old when they put the electricity in the house, and I can remember it pretty well because at the time I had one of those childhood diseases like smallpox, chickenpox, or measles, one or the other. And I was in bed. My mother wouldn't let me get out of the bed while they were wiring the house, and I remember the electrician coming through the room where I was laying in the bed, and that room didn't have any area above the ceiling, so they had to just run the wire along the ceiling and staple it to the ceiling. So it was exposed, and the electrician was like 6.5 feet tall. He was a tall man. His name was Humphrey. Can't remember his first name right off. But it was funny because the room was kind of short, low ceiling, and he had to stoop over when he was working in there. And while I was still laying in the bed sick, it was kind of strange. But anyway, they ran electricity through the house, and was mainly we just had lights, like one light in each room and one power receptacle in each room. But after that, we could have an electric powered radio instead of a battery powered radio, and I think that was the main thing we didn't have. Oh, my mother got an electric clothes iron, where before she'd had to heat the irons on the stove and iron the clothes. And we got an electric washing machine. It had a big wringer on top of it. So that was all the advantages of getting electricity, because my mother had to wash clothes in a wash tub before that. And so we had the washing machine, the radio.
What'd you think about it? I mean, I know that you did a lot with electricity throughout your career. Do you think that got you interested in it?
Yeah, I was interested in how radios worked and all that stuff from a young age. I don't know if that specifically had something to do with it, but it could have. Mainly, I was just curious about everything, about how automobiles worked and electricity and radios. And we had a small library, county library in our town. That was just one little room with bookcases around the walls. And they had a few books on scientific stuff and radio and electrical and stuff like that, and I would look at those books and read through them. And the librarian there at that time was an old lady, and she wouldn't let me check out those books. She said that those books were for adults. Children couldn't check them out. But I would check out the books, like mostly biographies, autobiographies of uh, famous people, George Washington and Abraham Lincoln, and of course Thomas Edison, Henry Ford. So all those I found interesting, and I read all the biographies and autobiographies they had there, and then shortly after that, the librarian retired, and a younger lady took over, and she would let me check out any books I wanted. So I got to check out the scientific books then and take them home with me and study them. And they didn't have a lot, but I remember the one they had about radio and how radios worked and so forth. And I figured out how to put antenna wires up outside in the trees and pick up radio stations from far away, like Chicago. And I know they had a station in Shreveport, Louisiana, and Del Rio, Texas. And I managed to pick up all of them. It was a lot more interesting than the local station that just mainly had old music and the news on the hour, every hour.
Did your family encourage you? Did they enjoy getting all those radio stations, or was that just a thing you did by yourself?
It was mainly just myself, because my parents didn't care much for the music that I liked. Of course, when rock and roll came out, that was the thing I was playing. They were satisfied to just have the local radio station, and my brothers and sister didn't care much for the music or any of the technical stuff either. When we were growing up, I guess when we got to be about 8, 9, 10 years old, something like that. I don't know how it happened. Oh, I do know how it happened. We used to buy, or not buy, I guess, order things from Sears and Roebuck. They would send out this big, huge catalog to all the people that lived out in the country like that, and I guess anybody and everywhere. The Sears catalog had everything in it that you could think of. It had clothing, shoes, anything people would wear, bedding, household stuff. But they also had things like bicycles, toys. That was the interesting part for kids. And so, we were fascinated by bicycles and thought, gosh, it'd be nice to have a bicycle. We could just ride it everywhere. And not many people around that part of the country had bicycles. That was unique, I guess. And they were expensive. Also, one of the local stores, the Western Auto, would sell bicycles, stuff like that. They were in the next town over in Missouri, which wasn't that far. It was like right next to Mammoth Spring, but we didn't go there very often. Went to Mammoth Spring most of the time because it was not the closest. But when we did go to there, if we got a chance, we'd run over to the Western Auto and look at bicycles and stuff like that. BB guns, bicycles. They even sold guitars, come to think of it. Anyway, because my Uncle Harold had bought one of those. But the first chance we got to get a bicycle was there was this used junk store, if you want to call it anything, it's a junk store, in Mammoth Spring that some old guy ran. And one weekend when we were there, we always went into town on Saturday. That's when we bought the few groceries that we had to buy. And so, most people went into town on Saturdays from out in the country because that's when they had the livestock sale. And so everybody just met in town and walked up and down the streets and gossiped and whatever. And so one Saturday we were there and they had this old bicycle in the junk store. And it was in pretty bad shape. Somebody had taped the tires onto it. I don't even remember if they held air. But they only wanted like $2 or $3 for it. So we aggravated my dad until he went over there and bought it for us. And then we had to figure out how to get tires for it. Well, you could buy tires at the Western Auto Store. They were probably $1.99 or something like that for a tire. So then we had to scrounge up enough money to buy some tires to put on it. But anyway, we finally got it to where it would operate. So that's the bicycle we learned to ride on. It was actually a girls' type bicycle that had it didn't have the crossbar at the top. It went down to the bottom, so you could just actually step through it. And it was a 26-inch bicycle, so it was a little bit too large and heavy for most of us, because we were just 8, 9, or 10 years old, I guess. But anyway, that's the bicycle that we learned to ride on. And eventually it just fell apart and we never did put it back together. And so later on, I guess I was maybe 11 or 12 years old, something like that. My friend Alvin Murphy, who lived like 3 miles away through the woods, he started riding bicycles. And I think his brother-in-law gave him his first bicycle. Just picked it up somewhere. And so he had accumulated like 3 or 4 bicycles over time that had fallen apart. And he managed to keep one of them going so he could ride it. And so I talked him into selling me enough parts to put a bicycle together. I think I paid him $1 for it. And I still had to get tires. That was always the problem because we lived out on those gravel roads where sharp rocks would just tear the tires up. And bicycle tires weren't very thick. At that time, they weren't very sturdy at all. They just weren't made for rocks. And so like I said before, like you could buy a bicycle tire for a couple of dollars, but a couple of dollars was pretty hard to come by. But somehow we would manage it. We'd pick up a little change here and there. And sometimes we would just have to patch up the tires by putting one tire inside of another tire and make it work. And usually it would go down, if you rode it on the pavement, it would go wompity wompity womp. Pretty rough ride, but anyway. Such was life.
So did you, how old were you when you were first learning with the bike from Western Auto? How old were you when you got that one? Like roughly.
Well, the first bicycle we had was the old junky girl's bicycle from the junk store.
Oh, the junk store, yeah.
And I was probably 8 years old. Actually, I think I have a photograph of that bicycle.
And then how old were you when you put together the bike out of the parts that you got sold?
I was probably about 12 years old when I put together that bicycle that I bought from Alvin Murphy for $1.
Mm-hmm.
And he just had the spare bicycle stuff thrown in a pile down below his house on the side of the hill. So I went down there and picked out enough stuff to, all I could find, to put together a bicycle, and and there were no tires, and gave him $1 for it.
And then I had asked about